Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here and for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to speak to you this morning. So without any further ado, I'd like to start with this intervention, in which I'll try to focus on our collective role as Africans, but specifically the role of governments, the role of parliaments in the structural decolonization, the economic transformation of the African continent. And it's really the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. And in this context, is because we're talking today in 2025, this is a unique moment, a window of opportunity for a Pan-African development vision, another development vision that will reposition the African continent at the center of a new multipolar world, at the center of a new international economic order. And with that, I want to bring this report to your attention. This is this Just Transition report, which is available on this website, justtransitionafrica.org, which we published a couple of years ago. A lot of my remarks will be building on some of the work from this report, which was published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which is an expert group convened by Dr. Yuba Sikuna from Mali, who at the time was the vice chair at the IPCC, and who asked us to write a just transition report from an African perspective in a way that will allow us to simultaneously think about climate, energy, and development issues, not in a siloed way, but rather in a coherent, comprehensive manner. And I think a lot of the remarks that I'll present today build on the work from that report. And I really encourage you to take a look at the report on justtransitionafrica.org. One of the motivations behind this report is really to put forward an African or a global South long-term strategic vision. Because if we don't have a long-term strategic vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we are already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And every major economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself. But so do we, right? If you're the United States, if you're China, if you're the European Union, you have a right to use your economic diplomacy, your incentives to nudge everybody to where you want to see them in your vision. And unfortunately, the African continent continues to be seen by major economic blocs as a continent that will continue to play the same colonial role that was imposed on us for decades. And I'll summarize this colonial role in three basic points. Number one, Africa is supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world, and we still play that role to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the place where industrial economies will sell their output, their technologies, their industrial output in our large consumer market. And our large consumer market will get larger by the end of the century. Will be 2.5 billion people on this continent. And we still continue to play that role. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And that colonial role, we still play that role to this day. Now, these three colonial roles that were imposed on us and continue to be imposed on us, let me remind you that colonial economic functions were not designed for development. They were not designed for industrialization. They were not designed to produce justice or protect human rights or to lead us to a just transition or to lead us to achieve the sustainable development goals. As you all know, colonial rules were designed in a way that was not democratic, that was violent, that was brutal, that was extractive, that was, hierarchical. So today, why do we expect the same economic architecture that was not designed by us, that was not designed for us, the economic architecture that was colonial by design? Why do we expect it somehow to produce democracy and justice and development and industrialization? By design, it cannot. So that's why we always say that we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, we cannot democratize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And for those of us who are interested in this issue of de-dollarization, you can't de-dollarize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And I'll explain and I'll show some numbers to illustrate. Now, that doesn't mean that we should wait for the structural decolonization to happen first, then we uh, become concerned with decarbonization and democratization and de-dollarization, all of that. No, what I'm suggesting is that these are simultaneous processes that as we talk about a just transition, as we talk about democratizing, as we talk about transforming our economies, we need to be precise in our approach. That is by undoing the three colonial roles that were imposed on us. And that's the process of decolonization that I talk about. Now, to be more specific, on this continent, we have uh, very specific structural deficiencies that continue to reproduce that colonial economic entrapment. And most of you are familiar with the problem of high external debt, that is, debt denominated in foreign currencies. The continent last year in 2024 paid more than $160 billion in debt service on our external debt. And that consumes a massive amount of fiscal policy space that could have been used on health, on education, on infrastructure, on climate adaptation, and so on. So external debt is a serious problem, but what I'm suggesting today is that it's actually a symptom of more serious, deeper structural issues that can be summarized in three major root causes. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, low value added manufacturing or industrialization deficits. And I'll explain each very briefly so we can see where we are. And I'll show you some numbers and I'll illustrate by looking at the Namibian economy in particular. But I could show you my own country, Tunisia. I can show you Kenya. I can show you Nigeria. I can show you any country on the continent. We all have the same structural deficiencies. So when I say energy deficits, um, I'm including our biggest oil exporter on the continent, Nigeria, which until a few months ago, when the Dangote refinery finally opened, Nigeria, up until a few months ago, imported 100% of its gasoline from international markets. And that is not by accident, it's by design. Angola, our second largest exporter of oil on the continent, to this day imports 80% of its fuel. Why? Because we on this continent have been denied in the old energy system, the fossil fuel system that we're trying to get rid of. We've been always denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. And similarly, today in the new energy system that we're trying to put in place, the renewables, we're denied access to the technology to manufacture and deploy renewables at scale. And we're the continent with the biggest potential for renewables. And we're also denied access to financing to manufacture and deploy renewables at scale. So that's the energy deficits. Food deficits. Africa today, according to UNCTAD, imports 85% of its food. And we're locked in a situation in which we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And the fact that we import 85% of our food today is not by accident, it's by design, because less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. But the rules of the game were immediately changed as soon as the continent started to gain independence in the 50s and 1960s, meaning the major economic blocs in the industrialized world started to heavily subsidize their agriculture to produce core crops, wheat, corn, soybean, barley, rice, and so on. And that starts with the European Union, which introduced CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, in 1962. But it wasn't just Europe, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine are so dominant in the grain industry, and the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on. So that put our farmers out of business in terms of not being able to compete in producing the core crops for our actual food security, for um, producing corn and rice and wheat and so on. So we ended up forced to specialize in exporting cash crops, more coffee, more tea, more tobacco, more cacao, more bananas, and so on. So supplementary food items, not the core food items. So what this process has done is to increase food insecurity on the continent. And just with these two deficiencies, food and energy, no country can function without food, without fuel. And we already have fundamental deficiencies on that front. And of course, no country can function without some basic manufacturing. So the kind of manufacturing that we were allowed to have on this continent, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, allowed to have, is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that produces low value added content for export, and what we import is high value added content. So no matter how much you double, triple, quadruple your exports with trade agreements and partnerships and this, that, and the other, you're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the value chain. Now, here's where the economics comes in. When you have these fundamental deficiencies, and there are other deficiencies, of course, today I'm focusing on the major ones. You have what we call structural trade deficit, year after year, decade after decade. And those structural trade deficits weaken our currencies relative to the US dollar, relative to the euro. And with a weaker currency, and you've experienced it yourself in Namibia, when the Namibian dollar becomes weaker relative to the euro, relative to the dollar, everything you import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine for your people, it will cost you more because you have a weaker currency. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our economy, food, fuel, and medicine in particular. And when you do that, you're basically asking for social unrest the next morning, unless our governments step in a defensive way to protect the most vulnerable, which is what we do to prevent that social unrest from happening. So what do we do as governments in Africa? We step in and we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we subsidize health services as much as possible, of course, and we ask our central bankers to do their best to strengthen the exchange rate, to defend the exchange rate. Now, how do central banks do it? In a sort of band-aid solution, they basically borrow more dollars or more euros and more British pounds, and therefore increase the vicious cycle of external debt. And now that you're stuck in an external debt trap in this vicious cycle, your lenders will start to micromanage your economy by imposing restrictions on what you do with those dollars that you borrow. Because they're giving you US dollars in loans, they want US dollars in return plus interest. So now they want you to prioritize all economic activity that is export oriented, which means the fastest way for them to get paid is extractive industries, meaning export oriented. So get yourself busy extracting and exporting, reproducing the same colonial role, and therefore neglecting the building blocks of development and prosperity that you need. So even as they tell you to decarbonize your energy system, and even as they lend you money to build green infrastructure for green electricity, for green hydrogen, they want it to be export oriented. Even if it feeds into a green industrial zone, like in Namibia, the green industrial zone has to be export oriented rather than manufacturing the building blocks of development and prosperity needed in Namibia or needed in the rest of the continent. And of course, there's a big label on it called green finance and climate finance and sustainability, but it's still extractive. And that is the economic entrapment that we're talking about. And now we can start talking about the transformation that is needed. In other words, we're not going to decolonize our economies if we're going to continue in this pattern. Now, let's look at some of the numbers. These are the numbers for the entire African continent here, and I hope the display is accessible. I'll send you the slides later so you can click on the link and you can look at any country you're interested in. This is Africa as a whole. This is 2022 data. Notice you can eyeball the problem. Africa's exports, raw materials, basically, petroleum products, gold, platinum, diamonds. The yellow categories are agricultural products, so lots of cash crops for exports and low value added manufacturing. And notice the volume of our exports as a continent, 767 billion. Now, let me show you our imports. Notice the switch in the number from 767 billion, we go to 886 billion. That is a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. Then you can also eyeball the composition of what we import. We import refined petroleum products. We import wheat and rice and corn, the core food products. We import pharmaceutical products and high value added manufactured industrial products. So the three structural deficiencies are on display on a continental scale. Now, zooming in on Namibia, and as I said, I could have showed you my own country, Tunisia or Kenya or Morocco or any other country. The structural deficiencies are the same. Notice the volume of Namibia's exports. This is 2022 data, 5.8 billion, and I'm sure you're familiar with the category. It's a lot of raw materials with very little value added, cash crops for exports. And now notice the imports of Namibia. We go from exports of 5.8 billion to imports of 7.9 billion. And notice the categories of items, right? We have those three structural deficiencies again on food, on energy, on manufactured products on display in Namibia as well. And again, not unique to Namibia. Now, the result of this is the constant pressure on the value of the Namibian dollar. Now, when that blue line is going up, that's the US dollar becoming more expensive relative to the Namibian dollar. Again, this constant pressure is not related to the COVID crisis or any particular crisis, a 2008 crisis or any other. It's constant pressure that goes on for decades. And the flip side of it is the rise in external debt. Sometimes we call it the mountain of debt, and that is true for Namibia, for all other African countries, and it's unsustainable, right? Now, zooming out of the continent, outside of Namibia, on a global scale, I want you to focus on that green line. I'll explain to you what it means. If we divide the world in two blocks, the global north and the global south, and if we net out all global financial transactions, that is exports, imports, foreign direct investment, interest payments, debt relief, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows are included here. The net amount is that green line. And the last data point that we have is showing us that we have $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. From the global south, $2 trillion to the global north, money moving in the wrong direction. And notice the green line has been accelerating in the wrong direction, which means the global economic architecture is designed for extraction of wealth and resources from the global south, and it's doing precisely what it was designed to do, meaning that we will not escape from this trap by waiting and pursuing the same kind of economic policies, the same kind of economic role that was imposed on us. So the structural decolonization is the only way to reverse this trend on a global scale. And I'll talk about how it can be done. But since we're talking a little bit about climate finance, to just to illustrate where we are, this is kind of my summary slide for climate finance. You have that big circle on the right-hand side of your screen is the $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. Next to it, at the center of the screen, you have the $300 billion promised at COP29 by the global north. And it's mostly loans, by the way. It's not going to be grants to be delivered in 10 years, maybe. Then that small green dot you have there is the Green Climate Fund. The last time I checked had about $16 billion on it. And that tiny little dot on the left side of your screen is not even $1 billion worth of money that was pledged for the loss and damage fund pledge from COP28. And none of this is going to put a dent in the problems that we're facing, in the droughts and the floods and the climate induced devastation that we're seeing all the way around the continent. And when you put this in perspective by looking at the annual profits of the four big extractors of fossil fuels on the continent, you will not find a single climate fund today that matches the annual profits of these oil and gas companies on the continent. And that is really the picture that tells us that the world is not really serious about climate finance, about any of the structural transformation that we need. So, um, but instead of real structural transformation, what we're being presented with is a series of dangerous distractions and false solutions. And I'll list some of them here quickly, and I'm happy to unpack as we move into the discussion later. The first one, the big one that they started pushing now in the last COP is carbon capture and sequestration. And this is promoted by the oil and gas companies. They're basically saying we will continue to burn fossil fuels, but we will use this technology to capture carbon and store it underground with this CCS technology that's been promised for more than 30 years now. And we always hear that, the breakthrough is in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have at scale technology, and it just never has been extremely expensive and never proven to work. So it's a false solution. The most dangerous solution that they present to us is solar radiation geoengineering. In other words, flying hundreds of aircrafts to around the planet to simulate the impact of a volcanic eruption. So they'll spray tiny particles that will essentially create a cloud over the planet. Those particles eventually will fall and will pollute the waters and the land all over the planet. But they will create a cloud shield that will cool down the planet so that oil and gas companies can continue to pump oil, and we can continue to burn carbon indefinitely. And that is one of the most dangerous things humanity can even attempt to do. Natural gas, we're told, as a transition fuel, even though it's a fossil fuel, it's a potent fossil fuel. But unfortunately, we've been uh, cornered into accepting it as a false solution also. Nuclear energy, same thing. It's very expensive. The technology is not controlled by the global south. And it takes at least a decade to build, and then um, no serious solution to this day in terms of being able to safely store the nuclear waste. So not a solution at scale. Green hydrogen, I want to spend a couple of minutes on green hydrogen because just like my country has been the target of green hydrogen production, your country, Namibia, has been one of the major targets of green hydrogen production. Now, green hydrogen, most of you are probably familiar with the technology, but I'll summarize it very quickly so that we know the technical aspects and why they're not fit for the needs of the African continent in particular, and why they reproduce colonial hierarchies, to be honest. Number one, green hydrogen requires fresh water. And your country is drought-stricken, just like my country, Tunisia. We have no water for agriculture, no water for human consumption as we speak. So the alternative is seawater desalination. And seawater desalination means you have to build the infrastructure for it. And in order for the hydrogen that is produced with the seawater, in order for it to be labeled green as opposed to blue or gray, the electricity that feeds the desalination plant has to be green electricity, solar or wind. And that means a huge amount of solar and wind capacity, which means land space has to be cleared for this solar and wind capacity in order to produce the green electricity that will then push the seawater through the reverse osmosis uh, desalination plant to go through the membranes to get the fresh water that you can then use to produce the green hydrogen. And that land use, as you know, in Namibia is displacing people from their own land. And in some cases, displacing people that have been displaced and have been hurt in a genocide during colonial times in your own country, and that is just reproducing the same colonial harm to the descendants of the same communities. Now, once the green hydrogen is produced, now, it's not going to be consumed in Namibia. It's not going to be consumed in Tunisia. It's not going to be consumed by industry. In green hydrogen is useful mostly as an energy storage. The problem is to ship green hydrogen from Tunisia or from Namibia or South Africa all the way to Germany, for example. You lose about 30% of the energy during the shipping process. So it's extremely inefficient. And it's extractive. It's extractive of the water resources. Now, that seawater desalination is not a neutral process because the toxic brine that remains after you filter the salt from the seawater, it's a toxic brine because it's not just salt. It's salt and all the chemicals from the filtration process from the membrane. Now, what do we do with that toxic brine? It's typically dumped in the ocean, and it's not dumped deep in the ocean, it's dumped close to the coast. And when you do that for a couple of decades, you basically kill your blue economy completely. And because you start warming, you increase the salt concentration in the area where you're dumping this toxic brine, and that warms the water, the temperature of the water, and that kills your marine life in that area. So not the most ideal energy investment for our countries. The next uh, false solution from our perspective, from an African perspective, are carbon markets. And here I'm highlighting a carbon market report, the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, which is available on the website of PowerShift Africa, powershiftifrica.org. We published this report a couple of years ago in 2023, I believe. You'll find the report on the website. Carbon markets, we call them pollution permits because essentially what they're doing is you have a polluter in the global north who is not willing to decarbonize or able to decarbonize. They buy a permit to continue their emissions. Let's say a steel factory or major manufacturer in Europe. Now, a carbon credit in Europe costs more than 100 euros. A carbon credit in Africa is about $3 to $5. So this is where they come to buy cheap carbon credits. Now, in order to offset their emissions, we have to designate the forest in Kenya, for example, as a carbon market territory to offset the emissions of a polluter in the global north. Now, that carbon market territory now has to be protected. Protected from whom? Protected from its own people, the indigenous population that's the actual custodian of the land for hundreds of years. So we displace local communities. We get $5 per unit. $5, by the way, that we use almost immediately to service our debt, right? Which means in terms of finance, it doesn't really provide any new finance. It's barely enough to service the existing debt. And then because the emissions are not reduced, because the polluter continues their emissions, the impact of climate change will eventually cause forest fires. And when that forest goes up in flames, it releases all the carbon that it was storing in the ground. So we're back to square one. The emissions are released, the pollution didn't stop, and was just wasted time and energy and resources on a false solution that doesn't actually change anything. Now, fossil fuel investments on the continent have always been an economic trap. And here I want to expose kind of the basic principles of this entrapment. That is, for Africa to be drained of its resources, to remain energy poor and in a perpetual debt trap. That is the concept that I want to expose here step by step by exposing the fossil fuel economic entrapment process. Number one, they've already hijacked the concept of the right to development, and you as parliamentarians and as government officials, this is the packaging that fossil fuel companies usually provide to our governments in Africa. They say, look, you're a sovereign country. You have the right to development. And by the way, you didn't cause the climate crisis. It's those rich countries in the north who industrialized and caused the climate crisis. So it's really not your problem. You're a sovereign nation. You have the right to development and you have these sovereign resources, oil and gas, and we're going to help you get rich and develop and use your sovereignty. So they hijack the concept of sovereignty and the right to development. But the first thing they tell you is you have to start borrowing up front because you need to partner with us. So you need to put some money on the table because we're building this pipeline to bring oil from the middle of the country all the way to the coast, and we need a pipeline. We need to fly our equipment. We need an airport. We need all of this. So you have to contribute to building the infrastructure. And don't worry, we'll talk to the bankers, our friends in Europe. They'll lend you money because they know this is an oil project. They know that you'll make money, so no problem, you'll get money. So you start borrowing money on day one before you even pump a single drop of oil. Then they tell you, by the way, we're only interested in extraction. We're not going to give you energy security. In other words, if you try to push for building a refinery for your own country to say, no, 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 your economy is too small. You don't need a refinery. What you need is for us to export the crude oil, and then we will help you import the refined fuel, the gasoline, the kerosene, the petrochemicals that you need. But you certainly don't need a refinery. Well, what do you need it for? So access to refining technology denied. your economy starts to grow, your population wants higher standards of living because they see oil money happening. So your economy starts to import even more fuel over time. So you become a big fuel importer consumer. So industrialization is an aspiration for all countries, except the only kind of industrialization you're allowed to have is assembly line manufacturing, locked at the bottom of the value chain, which requires huge fuel imports. So your fuel imports increase even more. And then at the end of the day, Africa's resources are drained, Africa's energy security is denied, and Africa's finances are in a perpetual debt trap. And that is the economic entrapment that we need to be aware of. And unfortunately, in the last 5 years or so, we see a comeback, another comeback of the fossil fuel companies on the continent, driving this narrative, hijacking this narrative. And what we want to say is that it is precisely because we're sovereign. It is precisely because we have the right to development that we shouldn't be locked into an old energy system that never provided energy security to the continent. I mean, if Nigeria was going to become an energy powerhouse that today would be delivering economic aid and development and prosperity to its neighbors, Nigeria is energy insecure. Nigeria is in a debt trap. Nigeria has all of the problems that you're familiar with. Same with Angola. Same with other countries. So this is a false narrative that they're selling to us. Our right to development is to choose. It comes to the financing of this climate problem that we're dealing with. No reparations, no grants, we're told, right? Only market-based greenwash solutions. Concessional loans, maybe to some extent, but mostly private loans. De-risking. They want us to do de-risking for foreign investors. In other words, you guarantee their profitability. Pollution permits, aka carbon credits and carbon markets, green industrialization. Here, I'm putting green industrialization in quotation marks because uh, uh, we're not allowed to have real industrialization. I'll come back to this point and I'll explain what I mean by that. Green extractivism, in terms of green energy, and decarbonization by dispossession. These are the only solutions or false solutions provided to us, and that's what needs to be exposed. What I want you to think of, if we want to flip the narrative, think of climate finance as an issue that addresses the climate debt problem that the global north has. Because since the Kyoto Protocol, the world has agreed that there's a certain amount of carbon that we are allowed to burn on this planet. And we've assigned a carbon budget to different countries based on their size of the economy, size of their population. So the global north has exceeded its carbon budget by far and is running into a deficit or running into a debt. And we in Africa, for example, we didn't even consume our carbon budget. So countries that have exceeded their carbon budget, they have a climate debt. And the concept of debt in economics and finance and law is very straightforward. If I owe you $100, I must pay you $100. You don't have to give me anything in return. But instead, in the climate finance space, this is how it works. Instead of me giving you $100, I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with it and set up conditionalities and restrictions and threaten to pull back the money. Then I give you lend you $7 at concessional rates, noblesse oblige, but then I impose conditionalities and restrictions to set you up in a debt trap. And then I say, I'm going to give you $10, but you have to give me your forest to offset my pollution, right? These are pollution permits or carbon credits. And then I say, I'm going to invest another $8, but you have to de-risk my investment to produce green hydrogen using your water and your labor and your sun and your wind to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you. right? And then I say, I'm going to invest another $12, but you must become my CBAM partner. Let me explain what CBAM is. CBAM is the European carbon tax, basically, the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which, the label says it's trying to do the right thing and fight climate change and so on, but it's really designed to lock us back in the same colonial position and serve the economic interests of the European Union. Because when you produce green products in Namibia's green industrial zone or in any other green industrial zone on the continent, the products that are assembled in Namibia, they will be shipped to the European Union and they will not pay the CBAM tax because they're green. In other words, the CBAM plus the Namibian Green Industrial Zone, what they produce is lower cost products for European consumers. So it's an inflation management tool for the European Union, but it's also a trade weapon against their competitors who don't have a green industrial zone yet in the global south. And that's why everybody now is rushing to introduce their CBAM and to invest in a green industrial zone in Africa and the rest of the global south. The UK already introduced their CBAM regulation. The US, Canada, Australia, Japan, they're all preparing CBAM-like regulations, and they're all going to come with a wave of investments, green investments, so-called green industrialization in Africa and the rest of the global south, so that we play the same role to do the assembly line manufacturing with our green electricity, with our energy, with our low cost labor, locked at the bottom of the value chain, and then ship the consumer products to them to keep the cost of consumer goods cheap for them and to be used as a trade weapon against their competitors who don't have green industrial zones. And all of it is labeled climate finance so that they come to COP and say, look, we're providing climate finance to Namibia, to Mauritania, to Egypt, to other countries. We're good partners in climate finance. But it's a false solution, and that's what needs to be exposed. So only these market-based economic entrapment solutions that are greenwashing the entire hierarchy, colonial hierarchy that we have. Now, from our perspective, climate debt should be put in the context of reparations. That is, you exceeded your carbon budget as a global north, you appropriated the atmospheric commons, you have a climate debt owed to the global south, and there's tons of studies estimating the cost of this climate debt. One of the most sophisticated studies available puts this price tag at $193 trillion. And I'll show you a quick summary of the numbers here. If you ignore India, if you ignore China, which is the sticky point in these negotiations, climate negotiations, just the sub-Saharan region in Africa is owed $45 trillion in climate debt when you take into account the time period of this study. The rest of the global south is owed $74 trillion. And I'm happy to share the links to this detailed study. Now, the structural solutions that we must focus on, because we looked at the structural problems. Number one is strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, not just in food security. Number two, strategic investment in renewable energy sovereignty, not just renewables for exports or renewables to feed into a green industrial zone. And number three, and most important, strategic Pan-African industrial policies, high value-added industrial policies, not just high-tech assembly line manufacturing, that prioritize three basic areas. Number one, renewables, infrastructure manufactured with our critical minerals, strategic minerals on the continent. Number two, clean cooking infrastructure, which is needed for almost 1 billion individuals on the continent inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children. And number three, green public transportation to build the logistics of development and prosperity on the continent. And here I insist on all of these being Pan-African industrial policies. Why Pan-African? I don't use the term Pan-Africanism as a kind of a soft, fluffy friendly term that we use in Addis when we're on the red carpet taking pictures together. No, no, no. I mean Pan-Africanism as a survival strategy, as a transformation, as the only way to industrialize. Because in order for a country to industrialize, it needs to have economies of scale. And all of our countries, Namibia, Tunisia, Morocco, Kenya, all of our economies are too small to industrialize alone because you don't have economies of scale. But collectively, as regional economic blocks, we have the economies of scale needed, and we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. As a continent, we're the size of China, we're the size of India, except richer, and we have the youngest labor force on the planet. So industrialization will not happen country by country. And that means if one country tries to industrialize alone, which is what all of our countries are trying to do, we end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy, and we're all locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is precisely how all of our ministries of industry have been designed on the African continent. And of course, the other piece of the structural transformation, not just reform, is the global economic architecture. That is the rules of finance, the rules of investment, the rules of trade, the rules of taxation, meaning reform, transforming the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the rules of international taxation, which thankfully is now being negotiated at the UN finally, when for decades it was under the control of the OECD countries, and that's a structural decolonization of international taxation that's happening as we speak. We need to do the same to the WTO, to the World Bank, and the IMF. And I insist on what I just highlighted: South-South uh, partnership and industrial policies, because it gives us the economies of scale we need, the complementarity of resources and capabilities. It allows us to build these horizontal linkages to create and retain high value added on the continent. And it allows us to focus on our priorities for resilience, on our food sovereignty, to manufacture the components for our energy sovereignty, our water security, education, training, health, the building blocks of development, rather than export-oriented manufacturing. And this is how a country acquires a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty over time. And if we as countries or regional blocks lack this basic level of resilience, we will not have any bargaining chips. We can't even walk away from a negotiation table, and we will continue to lose economic and monetary sovereignty. And here I want to quickly summarize that what I call the spectrum of industrial policies. On one end of the spectrum, we have economic entrapment, which is where we are, unfortunately. On the entrapment side, we specialize in producing low value added content. On the economic transformation side, this is where countries produce high value added content. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we're locked into this vertical extractive integration into the global value chain. We produce one component for the global value chain. On the other end of the spectrum, there's these horizontal linkages where you start to get the real benefits of industrialization at the domestic level, at the regional level, or at the global level. And on our side of the spectrum, as I described earlier, you import the machines, the fuel, the components, the packaging. On the better end of the spectrum, where we need to be, the focus is on research development, intellectual property rights, automation, robotics, advanced technical and vocational skills, innovation, design, marketing, competitive edge, finance, insurance, all of the expensive, high value added components of the value chain are on that end of the spectrum. And when it comes to the role of labor, on our end of the spectrum, we have weak labor bargaining position, and we have weak social and environmental protection because we're locked into that debt trap that weakens our negotiation position, our protective measures. On the higher end of the spectrum, you have stronger labor bargaining position. I'm not going to say labor unions are strong, the strongest, but they have stronger, and you have stronger social and environmental protection. And that means the outsourceable jobs in the global north they weaken both workers in the South and in the North, and therefore lock us back into this position and force us to race to the bottom to attract those outsourceable industries that are moving out of Europe, out of the United States, out of the industrialized world. And what we're seeing today is a cycle of greenwash, rinse, and repeat of this division of industrial assignment. We're locked at the bottom of the value chain. We're not allowed to achieve that transformation, and it's all now greenwashed with green hydrogen and green industrial zones and this, that, and the other. Now, here's where the good news is, and here's where our role as governments, as labor unions, as parliamentarians is to work towards the transformation. So I'm going to start sharing some good news and some good strategies as we close this discussion. Number one, all the green minerals, the critical minerals, the strategic minerals, depending on how you want to label them. We have them in the global south. We have them in Africa. We have them in Latin America. They're mostly here, and that drives, the countries that don't have them, that actually need them for military purposes, for high-tech purposes, for AI purposes. All the minerals are on this continent. So we have the advantage of having all the resources that we need for our transformation. And this is what I call the geopolitical bargain of the century. And this is where the pressure from below, meaning from social movements, from academics and think tanks, from politicians, all the way up to heads of states, because geopolitics is a game played by heads of states. And parliaments have an important role in terms of preparing the groundwork, the blueprints that are presented to heads of states to transform our economies. And here, what we want to say is that Africa and the global south, we finally have a plan for ourselves. So this is not the G7 plan for Africa, the Matai plan for Africa, or the American plan for Africa. This is Africa's plan for Africa. And this is what I call the $0 industrial policy, or the $0 climate action plan. And one big component of this struggle has to do with the transfer of technology and joint ventures in order to unleash this potential. Because the structural transformation, when I showed the solutions that we need, we have the labor force, we have all the materials that we need, we have the economies of scale. We're lacking two things, basically. Number one is the political will at the highest level to start thinking in terms of joint industrial policies, joint energy policies, joint agricultural policies. And that requires trust, that requires heads of states to do the diplomatic work at the regional level to build these regional economic blocks. So that's number one. Number two is access to the manufacturing technology to allow us to leapfrog into producing the solar, the wind, the clean cooking, the high-speed rail infrastructure, all the building blocks of development that we need on our terms and at scale. Because the manufacturing technology is available today. It's available in China, in Japan, and the US and Europe, but it's intentionally withheld from us. And I'll share with you why that is the case, because unleashing our potential is unfortunately perceived as a threat, as a disruption, because we're disrupting the colonial hierarchy. So everything is done to prevent that transformation. I'll give you one example in the energy system. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, in their 2021-2022 report on Africa, they basically said, and it's a technical study, they said with existing renewables technology, not new innovations, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated electricity needs by 2040. By 2040, that's in 15 years, we can produce 1,000 times our needs, which means we turn the continent into an energy and industrial powerhouse. Now, the continent with this huge potential is denied access to the technology and is denied access to financing. Why? It's not because the money is not available, technology is not available, because unleashing this potential is perceived as a threat by our partners, unfortunately, a threat to be eliminated, a risk to be managed. And that's why we're denied this structural transformation. So now, how do we convince the rest of the world that this is actually a win-win scenario, that this should not be viewed as a threat, that we as a continent escaping the bottom of the geopolitical hierarchy should not be a threat, but should be our well-deserved position at the center of a new international economic order rather than at the bottom of the hierarchy like during colonial times. And this is where the bargain of the century comes in. And today I'll focus on the role of China, the US, and the EU, the major economic blocs. I listed Japan, but you can add Russia, you can add other key players. But it's really today, the geopolitical moment is an intense competition primarily between China and the US. To a lesser extent, there is the EU. Imagine for a second, and I'm asking for your patience and imagination. Imagine that we've convinced heads of states that we need joint industrial policies. Imagine for a second that we have our parliaments, that we have our ministries of industries, ministries of mines, ministries of energy have co-designed at the regional level. Imagine at the SADC region, for example, that we've co-designed and pre-negotiated the entire distribution of the value chain of, say, replicating the entire value chain of manufacturing solar panels, wind turbines, clean cooking infrastructure, high-speed rail across the 16 countries of the SADC region in a way that actually provides the win-win for everybody, so that after 30 years of joint industrial policy, not only we transform the economies, but we also transform the hierarchies from within, so that after 30 years, it's not South Africa at the top of the hierarchy and Malawi at the bottom of the hierarchy. Everybody develops and transforms in a strategic way. So imagine we've done our homework, we've pre-negotiated the terms of this joint industrial policies with respect to protecting labor rights, protecting rights of frontline communities in terms of extractivism, biodiversity protection. We've pre-negotiated the ownership structure, the distribution of the value chain. All of that is our collective homework to do to avoid reproducing the global hierarchies that we suffer from today. So we're co-designing a new world order based on our own terms. And we've done our homework and we have our blueprints ready to go. And now we're missing one key component. We're missing the manufacturing technology. Now, normally we pay for our labor with our domestic currencies. Check. We pay for our resources with domestic currencies. Check. Where we usually need dollars is to import the manufacturing technology. But if you import manufacturing technology with a loan, now the lender will impose that your industry must be export oriented, and now you're again neglecting the building blocks. Now imagine instead of a loan, we go to a technological partner and say, we offer you a joint venture deal if you accept our terms and you come in as a in-kind contributor with the technology to manufacture and with the transfer of skills and know-how, and we build a pipeline of vocational and educational skills so that we have a 30-year joint industrial policy that feeds with the right kind of skills from the continent and so on. Imagine that is the bargain that we're offering. The first country we need to go to, and for reasons that I'll explain, is China, because it's the country that has all the technology that we need, and it's the country that is more willing today to share technology. Imagine we go to China with what I call the bargain of the century and say, here's the deal. If you agree to share technology, to manufacture and deploy, let's say, solar at scale on our terms, not on Chinese terms, then here's what we give you in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, you double your geopolitical weight globally, and you secure privileged access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. In addition to that, if we trigger this process of real industrialization and development, and we start having the actual rising purchasing power domestically in this economic bloc, let's say SADC, every other country in the global south will want to join in this process. So we give you privileged access to the largest market on the planet. We are the global majority. Remember, by the end of the century, we'll be 2.5 billion people on the African continent alone. I guarantee you China will take the bargain and will share technology on our terms. Better terms than negotiating one-on-one with China, by the way, which is what our countries do today. Now, the goal of this bargain is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to use this process to trigger this bargain in order to get the second bargaining chip that we need to then go to a country like Germany or France or Spain and say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you agree to share your manufacturing technology on our terms as a joint venture partner to manufacture and deploy high-speed rail on the continent, to manufacture and deploy pharmaceutical technology. So you build a shopping list basically of the building blocks of industries and technologies you need, and you go to the countries that have them and you invite them to join this bargain on terms that are favorable to us, not colonial terms. At that point, Germany or Spain or France or the US, they cannot say no to these offers, because if they say no, we can go to another country or we can go back to China and let them quadruple their economic and geopolitical weight. In other words, the countries that will reject this offer of true partnerships as equal, they will join the global minority and isolate themselves from the global majority and the new economic architecture that we're designing. And this is how we rewrite the rules of international trade under a new international economic order. And we create a new multipolar world of peace and sustainable prosperity in which the African continent is at the center rather than at the bottom of the system. And this is really a revival of a movement that existed in the 1970s. This is a report that I invite all of you to take a look at, called What Now? Another Development, from 1975, in which a lot of these ideas about a new multipolar world, post-colonial world, truly decolonized world, uh, a lot of these ideas were discussed there, but then a lot of these ideas were aborted because of the Cold War and other issues. And if you're interested in this idea of the bargain of the century, my co-author and I just recently published this piece at the Institute of Economic Justice in South Africa. And the last section of this piece on debt, the last section, I summarize the geopolitical bargain of the century. And it's actually a book that I'm currently writing on and describing all the details of this bargain of the century. So to conclude, the time to act is now. This multifaceted crisis calls for urgent, bold, and radical action. Radical, I don't mean radical in the political sense of the term, although you can take it in the political sense of the term, but I really mean it in the literal sense of the term. Radical means going to the roots of the problem. And if we don't go to the roots of the problem, then we're operating at the surface level. And what do we call surface level intervention? We call it superficial intervention. And superficial intervention doesn't produce transformation, doesn't produce change. It reproduces the status quo. And that is unaffordable for us. The current climate finance framework is not going to deliver any meaningful climate action, let alone economic transformation. Refocusing the climate finance discussion on just an equitable transition and climate reparations cannot happen without an economic and geopolitical leverage. When you go to these climate finance discussions, you can make the moral case, the ethical case, the legal case, the economic case. It doesn't matter at the end of the process if you don't have an economic leverage, a geopolitical leverage. Your words are basically ignored in these negotiations by the powerful nations. So we must create the bargaining chip that gives us that leverage. And no country is going to create it alone. It has to be collective action. And when I say Pan-Africanism, Global South unity, Global North solidarity, these are the economic and geopolitical prerequisites for climate reparations, for a just and equitable transition, and a new multipolar world of peace and sustainable prosperity. So Pan-Africanism is a survival strategy. I often joke and say it's either Pan-Africanism or death. There's no in between, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of economic transformation, in terms of climate action. And this better system that I'm describing is within reach. It's like the real Wakanda that they talk about in that movie, and is possible, desirable, and affordable. And your role as parliamentarians in this process with the rest of us, academics, think tanks, trade unions, and media, journalists, is to inform. You have a convening power as politicians, as MPs, to inform, educate, open the public discourse about the kind of transformation that allows us to escape from the false solutions, from the dangerous distractions, and then join us in mobilizing and organizing and building up the coordination efforts at the national level, at the regional level, and then providing our heads of states with bulletproof blueprints that are actually technically feasible. And then we collectively work on building the geopolitical collective bargaining chips and power that we need so that we can transform the world on our terms rather than wait for the world to deliver some kind of gift to the African continent, which will never happen for reasons that I explained today. So thank you again for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.